Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There's a good line from a Rolling Stones song that comes to my mind that, for me, kind of characterizes the political situation we find ourselves in. Uh, you may know the song Wild Horses, and the line goes like this: I watched you suffer a dull, aching pain. That's kind of how I feel about the Donald Trump presidency because it just goes on, literally like this dull, aching pain. Dull in the sense that one almost fears a sense of what if we were to become desensitized by just this constant lawlessness, this constant obstruction, this constant discouragement. He just doesn't stop. And if he's not met with ample resistance, what happens to the state of this nation? So, you know about perhaps efforts in Congress, the House of Representatives, to try and hold him accountable in some way, shape, or form, specifically in the wake of the Democrats having taken the House in the midterm elections, and of course, in the wake of special counsel Mueller's release of his report, which I'm still slowly thumbing through. You know, it's over 100 pages. So that's quite a task. Anyway, I think one of the rather deeply discouraging things is best characterized in one of the New York Times articles today by Charlie Savage. Trump vows stonewall of all House subpoenas. I mean, essentially, right, what's going on is this. The House of Representatives is seeking testimony from people in the executive branch to get a sense of what's going on, get a little bit more transparency. This responsibility falls on a very particular body within the House of Representatives. And if you're not acquainted with them, allow me to introduce them to you. That would be the committee, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, which you may or may not know is chaired by Elijah Cummings. So we find ourselves in a bit of a situation here as the House Committee on Oversight and Reform is trying to bring in members of the Trump administration for a little bit of what we call oversight and transparency. However, the disconcerting thing here is that the president is instructing these people not to comply. This is deeply disturbing, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps you are aware of the president's his recent tweet. He tweets, if the partisan Dems ever tried to impeach, I would first head to the US Supreme Court. Let's think about that for a second. Does the president not know anything about the Constitution, separation of powers, functions of government, functions of various branches of government and bodies of government? I mean, as we sort of establish a basis of a concept of oversight here. But along with this theme, right, is the president trying to thwart people from speaking to Congress and the Oversight and Reform Committee. Right, so in particular, we have his former lawyer, McGahn, I, of course, want to pronounce his name correctly. Um, and the Trump administration is trying to pressure this gentleman not to speak. And that's a little disconcerting. Um, we also have, who else? We have Steve Mnuchin of the Treasury that Congress wants to speak to, who is not speaking. Former head of White House personnel security, Carl Klein. He has, as the New York Times reports, ignored a subpoena ordering him to appear for a deposition. Civil Rights Division official of the Justice Department, John Gore, is expected to defy a subpoena to testify on Thursday, today. So you see here, we have members of the executive branch of our government refusing to be subjected to oversight via the Congress. And we see here then a very dangerous situation. Obviously, this is nothing new, and that gets back to that Rolling Stone quote that I put out there for your consideration. I watched you suffer a dull, aching pain. I mean, it's just day after day after day of this president and his supporters and his people doing anything they can to take a hold of a inappropriate, unbalanced degree of power in a rather, shall we say, authoritarian, autocratic fashion. And so I think that from an activist perspective, while we certainly want to encourage due process, as I said yesterday, and ensure that all of the information can come to light in a reasoned, level-headed way, that doesn't mean that we don't call for the beginning of some form of impeachment proceedings. And so certainly I encourage everybody to call your members of Congress and say that you want the president impeached for, among things, among his impeachable offenses, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, violation of the Emoluments Clause. These are things that are going on here. And I just think that we really shouldn't stand for this. It's like akin to not taking care of yourself. That's the way I think of it. It's just not healthy to have a president like this. And it's time to do something about it. And again, I'm all for the process happening. I'm not saying that today Congress should say impeach or not impeach. I am saying that there should be a investigation into impeachment proceedings that should begin as soon as possible. So that's what I have to say about that. But look, I also think that members of Congress should receive a phone call. As you know, no one's to stop members of the Senate from urging for impeachment proceedings in some way, shape, or form to begin. As Senator Elizabeth Warren, the good senator of Massachusetts and presidential candidate, Democratic presidential candidate, she called for the impeachment of the president. So even though members of the Senate don't vote on impeachment itself, they conduct the impeachment trial. That doesn't mean they can't use their voice. We all have a voice, and we all ought to use our voice. These are unfortunate times where we have to be, I think, more politically invested than uh, other times. So, with that in mind, I say to you, please do call your members of Congress, call your senators, and take a look at this New York Times article to learn a little bit more about these various efforts the president is making to obstruct moves by Congress to hold the executive branch to some form of accountability. And I've said my piece on that. Now I kind of want to chat about the Democratic primary with you. It's starting to jazz up. It's starting to get a bit exciting, you could say. And we are seeing more and more campaigning activity underway. And so that's for us to chat about now. So yeah, the whole Bernie Sanders thing I wanted to talk to you about. Let me preface this conversation about Bernie Sanders with this. He's not my choice among the candidates running in the Democratic primary. He's not my choice. If it were a choice between him and Trump, of course, I would vote for Bernie Sanders. But I don't believe that Bernie Sanders is the ideal choice, is the ideal candidate for us. That said, I'd also warn against people who are going on a sort of utter attack against Bernie Sanders. And this will tie into what I want to say about Joe Biden as well. Because I think there was a lesson to be learned in 2016 with the election of President Trump. And I do believe it has to do with more than just a despot of nationalism that is poisoning and troubling this country. I think also there is frustration with a sense of the establishment. There's frustration with the same old on both sides of the political spectrum. And so I think that if people sort of excessively chastise and try to tarnish Senator Bernie Sanders, that there could be a backlash, and that not only could that result in Bernie Sanders actually becoming the Democratic candidate, but we might be inducing a bit of extremism on the left that we want to be mindful of and careful of. We don't really want to, I think, incite anger, as has happened on the right. I think we want to be very reasoned, level-headed about our politics this time around. And so I say that taking a look at how some people are talking about Bernie Sanders. So I was reading this good New York Times article by Thomas B. Edsall. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he writes typically once a week, if I'm not mistaken. And he writes really good articles. He's heavy on quotations, and he's good on analysis, and speaks with a lot of experts to sort of have a well synthesized picture of things. And in this case, he's examining Bernie Sanders. And I want to talk a little bit about how some people are painting Bernie Sanders. If we read from this article, we have one gentleman, the font. You see, I print these really small so that I can save paper. So you forgive me if it makes me squint a bit here. I need to get better at this. Indeed. I'm trying to find this gentleman's first name. I've got his last name, Jaff. The letters are so small, and I hole punched where his first name might have been. Anyway, we've got this analyst looking at early Bernie Sanders, and there's a conversation to be had about one's past, isn't there? And especially one's distant past. And to what degree should that come back to haunt you? Obviously, we saw that arise specifically in the case of, say, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, right? We examined questions about perhaps sexual abuse that occurred in his college days. We, of course, did not see a thorough investigation into that, despite a multitude of allegations. And that's a whole other conversation in itself. However, we're talking about this topic of to what degree should your past matter? And to what degree does it depend on what it is that happened in your past? I mean, I'll be blunt with you. I'm certainly not thrilled with who I was 10 years ago at 33. So I would have been 23 at that time. My father had passed away and I had inherited some money, and I had said, F it all, and just read and wrote and evaded all notions of responsibility and awareness of the world and relationships and family and friendships and wellness and all of these really important things. And what was so oblivious that first of all, it just brings back really bad emotions to even look back at those days. But, it's like this awful fog. And I have to ask myself, do I want those days to plague me? And to what degree should they or shouldn't they? And it's a fair question, obviously. In the case of Brett Kavanaugh, right? The guy was accused of some serious sexual abuse allegations there. And so there was cause to look into these things. Of course, the Republicans in the Senate did everything they could to prevent a thorough investigation into that from happening. And that's obviously disconcerting. Okay, so we've brought up this topic. So what about Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders' past? Ed Sell brings this up in this article, and I'm going to just read a little passage here from you, and we'll talk about it. So he's citing a few people. Jaff reported in the 1969 Freeman essay how Bernie Sanders had asked, quote, "How much guilt, nervousness have you imbued in your daughter with regard to sex?" And Bernie Sanders continued with the question, "If she is 16, 3 years beyond puberty, at the time which nature set forth for childbearing, and spent a night out with her boyfriend, what is your reaction? Do you take her to a psychiatrist because she's maladjusted, or a prostitute, or are you happy that she found someone with whom she can share love? Are you concerned about her happiness or about your reputation in the community?" So Bernie Sanders is writing an essay in the college paper back in the day, back in the 60s, about female sexuality and female sexual openness and different ways people may react to this. And look, I mean, what you do in your life, especially things you put out on the public record, of course, are fair game for people to scrutinize. But, I mean, first of all, we're looking back to what, 1969? we're looking back to something that Bernie Sanders wrote in a college essay back in 1969 and trying to somehow like make him look bad because he's talking about female sexuality in the wake of the sexual revolution. And we're worried that this is somehow going to make him unelectable, in contrast to Trump, who openly brags about committing acts of sexual abuse. I just don't see how that is a logical deduction. And again, it just comes across to me that people are looking for ways to smear Bernie Sanders because they're afraid of him. And I had prefaced this conversation by saying, not myself a deeply enthusiastic Bernie Sanders fan, I nonetheless don't believe that we should be going out of our way to make him look so bad. Instead, have an objective conversation. This article proceeds. Murphy, in the Mother Jones article, describes Sanders' lifestyle in the 70s. And again, let's remind ourselves, it's what, 2019? And we're talking about the 1970s. That's many decades ago. Anyway, citing a description here of Bernie Sanders' lifestyle. He was living in the back of an old brick building, and when he couldn't pay the electric bill, he would take extension cords and run down the basement and plug them into the landlord's outlet. And apparently a neighbor of his made this observation. His fridge was empty, but the apartment was littered with yellow legal pads filled with Sanders' writings. When he was eventually evicted, he moved in with a friend. I just get, okay, he was evicted in the 70s. Okay. If he was convicted 4 years ago, I would be concerned. But we're talking about his life in the 70s, and I just don't know that this has anything to do with the question of his policies and whether or not he would make a good or bad president. It just seems to me like besides the point. Talks then about how he was married twice, fathered a son with a third woman with whom he briefly lived, but I guess was not married. I just think, so what? And that's not to say that I don't contemplate how someone treats the people that are in their lives, but it just seems to me like people are starting to try and make Bernie Sanders look bad in very non-objective ways. And doing this with the attempt to make him look unelectable. And again, I think it would just be better if we kept this in a sort of, shall we say, objective policy discussion. I mean, obviously someone's character and someone's personality and someone's just general life record is a valid conversation to have. But the gentleman from Vermont, Senator Sanders, has been in the Senate for a very long time and, is no longer living this lifestyle of getting evicted and having a sloppy apartment and etc. I just don't see how this has anything to do with having a good policy discussion. That said, that's one side of the examination of Bernie Sanders. People sort of trying to just tarnish his personality and detract from the more important aspects of the conversation. The same article, however, does look at some policy issues. And this is where we really need to have a conversation about Bernie Sanders. And I might add that there's a silver lining, in my opinion, with Bernie Sanders entering this race. While he's not my choice, in the Democratic primary. He's not the person I see myself casting a vote for. Um, his radical political views have, I do note, um, incited interesting discussions about the proper political philosophy that Democrats ought to consider and adhere to. And, that's a conversation about being a socialist versus a capitalist, and to what degree should we be capitalistic? To what degree should we be considering socialism? Why not? And so, citing this article again, Thomas Edsall looks at a professor of economics from MIT who says that Sanders economists don't understand basic economics. They're not just dangerous, they're clueless. And that's interesting, right? Because the fact is, Bernie Sanders does promote himself and flaunt himself as this socialist. And we must ask ourselves, first of all, when you call yourself a socialist, what do you really mean? And why is this so important? Moving on with this article. Socialist regimes from Cuba to the Eastern Bloc have been disastrous for both economic prosperity and individual freedom. Very true. And so the same thing could be said about Ocasio-Cortez, right? The congresswoman, the young, enthusiastic congresswoman from New York, who I think, by the way, has tremendous potential, who I think one day may be the president of the United States, has a bit of a learning curve. But the way these people throw around the word socialism does, I think, give us cause to dissect that a little bit and ask some serious questions. And again, that is, what do you mean when you say you are a socialist? And so let's have a conversation about what is socialism. Let's get a few definitions here, shall we? By the way, you can take the pure Marxist notion of socialism to mean, literally abolishing private property and leaving to the state the responsibility of managing and allocating and rationing resources. Not a good idea for a lot of reasons. Of course, Bernie Sanders doesn't say that he's that kind of socialist. If you press him, you'll note that he's not waving his hands around saying, well, I'm for the pure abolition of private property and pure state management of resources. So why is he going on calling himself a socialist? By the way, I'd have a bone to pick then with Lawrence O'Donnell, who does, the evening talk show on MSNBC at 10 p.m. every night, who says that, Medicare is socialism, Medicaid is socialism, Social Security is socialism. I just would have to disagree with Lawrence O'Donnell and anyone who says every time that you have a sort of social welfare kind of program that amounts to socialism. I just think that's not true. So let's look at what is socialism and get a few definitions, shall we? Okay, if you were to just Google socialism and what it means, here's a definition you would get from the Google dictionary. And I'm not saying that Google is the end all on the meaning of words, but let's be clear about the kinds of things we're talking about, right? As Google says, the definition of socialism, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole, right? Which by implication means no private property. Okay. Um, let's look at a few other definitions. So here's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of socialism. Any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. So, to be clear, then, when Bernie Sanders says he's a socialist, if you hold the man accountable for his words, what he's saying, and I'm not saying this is what he means, and this is one of the huge problems with Bernie Sanders. You forget what his sex life was in the 60s or his approach to female sexual liberation in the 60s has nothing whatsoever to do with his policies. Let's talk about the man and what he says today and he advocates today, not 50 years ago, please. And have an objective conversation. When Bernie Sanders says he's a socialist, the implication here, you hold the man accountable for his word, right? What he's saying is that he is for government managing our resources and not you and I having any possession, legal, private possession of our resources. And what does that mean, right? That means that your money isn't your money, but instead, you get ration cards from the government. And you get told how much of something with that little ration card that you can get. Have you looked at exactly how Cuba works, Mr. Senator Sanders? Let's see if we can get a few other definitions of socialism here. Let's do vocabulary.com. I was once chastised. In fact, I've been chastised numerous times for using vocabulary.com. However, I quite like vocabulary.com. Why? Because vocabulary.com tries to make words as clear to use as possible. I would say like 96% of the time, you get a good definition off of this website. So here's what vocabulary.com has to say about socialism. These days, the word socialism gets tossed around so much it's almost lost all meaning. Well, that's exactly what I was just saying about Bernie Sanders, right? He says socialism, but does he really mean socialism as we understand the concept to mean if we use the word as it's been officially defined? Originally, though, it was the bedrock of Marxism and meant that workers and their community should control the market for what they make. Because the Soviet state eventually strayed far from Marx's idea of socialism towards Lenin's totalitarian communism, socialism is now often used to mean everything from fascism to progressivism. But in its purest form, socialism was a political, social, and economic system meant to empower the working class. In the US today, though, it's often used as shorthand for the services that government provides and which are paid for by taxes, depending on who's talking. That idea is either a goal or a target. So then what's interesting about this website is you get a sense of what a word really means versus how the word is being used. And we have to ask ourselves also then, why are certain words being used? And what is the intellectual responsibility or a lack of responsibility that comes across with someone who uses this kind of language and doesn't share a mindfulness of the context and implications of that language? And so that would to me be a seriously disconcerting thing about Sanders being president. Even if I lived in Vermont, that would be a concern of mine with him as my senator. I'm just not comfortable with someone waving around the word socialism without being mindful of the fact that by socialism, under that umbrella of what that word can imply, is the utter abolition of private property and the government rationing resources and managing resources entirely and telling you what you can have without your own, private enterprise and efforts to gain what you can. And I'm not saying that we need to view money as an end all. I'm not saying that we need to think about capitalism in some sort of greed context or some kind of context where all we care about is money, or where we view capitalism as this perfect policy, this perfect economic and political concept, right? Because it's not. But that's another thing. To just say that you're a capitalist really doesn't have a good enough meaning either, does it? What do we mean when we say I'm a capitalist? Which is why, again, Bernie Sanders just lacks this sense of a nuanced, intellectually responsible, in my opinion, way of talking, which makes me uncomfortable with the notion of him as president. That said, that's the conversation I would want to have, not what he wrote about sex in the college newspaper in the 1960s. I mean, seriously, come on. I expected better from some of these people. And so there's another really good point when we're talking about words that we use and how we apply them to our political philosophy that I like. And this wouldn't be the first time I'm saying this, and this wouldn't be the first time I've seen this. But the concept, the term social democracy, that's a really good concept, because social democracy is different than socialism or democratic socialism, as I think Bernie Sanders sometimes likes to be a little bit more specific. But by the way, that doesn't absolve him of the problem of asking what he means, because Marx talks about democratic socialism as well, and how democracy can be used to achieve the socialist dream, if you would call it that, right? So there's democratic socialism, not to be confused with social democracy. There are social democrats and there are democratic socialists. What's the difference, right? The real difference is that a democratic socialist is someone who believes, I mean, if you hold them accountable to their words and what the words mean outside of the subjective definitions that they throw in there, that's a totally different conversation to have. But a democratic socialist is someone who believes that the state should manage all of our resources and ration them and appropriate them to us how they feel it would be most suitable to their desires. And that we would just manage this and come about this in a democratic way. So, you can vote for your tyrants as opposed to just having them arise through a more totalitarian style. A social democrat, on the other hand, is someone who's mindful of the fact that capitalism in its pure form is flawed and is damaging to the well-being of society. It causes harm to people. When you have a laissez-faire system in which everybody is so free economically that they can exploit one another, to a point where people are starving, mentally ill, physically ill, and chronically unable to support themselves because they're so busy trying to make just enough, to feed themselves and continue on with the subjugation and exploitation. And so a social democrat is someone who's mindful of this imperfection of pure laissez-faire capitalism and says, no, no, we need rules to make the free market more fair. And that's why I call myself a social democrat. Bernie Sanders is not a social democrat. And it's important to make that distinction. And so the silver lining on all of this is I think this is the time that Democrats have been waiting for to really have a conversation about what distinguishes, an American Democrat ideology versus pure socialism or democratic socialist. And they've misspoken about saying just an American Democrat in a really loose way, as if there's only one kind. So I do apologize about that. But when we're talking about what the Democratic Party platform should be, that's what I mean. The Democratic Party needs to reconcile exactly the depths to which they believe that government has a role in looking out for people. Is their role to look out for people with such overprotectiveness that they deem no one who's part of the government should have a role in managing resources, that we can't manage our own resources? Or do they say, we acknowledge the benefits of the free market, the generally free market, but want to make sure that people aren't severely hurting one another and taking advantage of one another in that system? And that's what Democrats really need to become explicit about. I mean, I'll tell you, looking back to around 2011, 2012, 2013, when I slipped away from my period as a Democrat into libertarianism, one of my frustrations with the Democratic Party was, as I understood it, and I was new to politics in those days anyway, but as I understood it, there was not any real wealth of articulation on exactly how Democrats might distinguish themselves from socialists. And so the silver lining with the Bernie Sanders candidacy this time around, because it just didn't tend to happen in 2016, another conversation, there just wasn't a good conversation about the distinction between what the Democratic Party platform should be and what a socialist is. I could still recall, was it the chairwoman of the DNC at the time, Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, was asked in an interview, is she a socialist, or what is socialism? What is the difference between socialism and a Democrat? And she just refused to answer the question. And that, I believe, damaged the Democratic Party. Democrats need to be clear what the difference between a Democrat is and a socialist is. And certainly, as I move forward in my communications and activism on the topic, one of my priorities would be articulating that difference. So bottom line here then is, with respect to Bernie Sanders, let's please not go and have these subjective smears about who he was in the 1960s, half a century ago, when he was writing for the college paper, or how he struggled in the 70s as if he weren't a starving artist. God forbid people try and live minimalistically and figure things out in their 20s. Been there and done that. Perhaps you have too. And by the way, if we look at our past presidential candidates, not just past presidents, right? Whether you're talking about George Bush or Barack Obama, they both admitted to things that they were not entirely proud of. I believe you can read in President Obama's memoir, Dreams of My Father. I know I read it. And he talks about having tried cocaine. I believe that Bush had that issue and was an alcoholic. And I believe Clinton smoked pot. And I'm sure there are all kinds of things that our prior presidents have done that really stray quite far away from policy and what they could or could not offer us politically, and really aren't all that necessary to focus on. So, and we must ask ourselves, what is the consequence of fixating on these sort of unnecessary aspects of a candidate, like what they wrote in the college paper 50 years ago? I think you would see a backlash. I think if you saw Biden supporters, people on the Biden team or people on the Elizabeth Warren team going after Sanders in such a way that it was focusing on what he wrote 50 years ago in the 1960s in his college paper versus how he can't properly articulate democratic socialism and what he even means by that, I think you're going to piss a lot of people off. And you're going to have a backlash that was the kind of backlash that led people to rally around Trump, which look how catastrophic that has been. And, you know, there are political scientists out there who tell you about the pendulum and how we swing from right to left. And there's an argument to be had that we will swing very far to the left and that there will be this sort of populism of the left, anger of the left, anti-intellectualism of the left that overpowers the more academic, intellectual left and takes over. But be mindful of the kinds of things that incite this over-emoting of the voters. In my opinion, it's when you don't have a fair, respectful conversation. You piss people off. It's only natural that when people don't have their emotions in check, that kind of thing can happen. So let's not try to incite that. Let's try to have like a healthy, loving, cool, constructive, democratic, inclusive debate and dialogue about how we make this country, how we make this world a better place to live in. Why not? It certainly beats what we've got with the current president, right? The current president who is against all forms of oversight, the president who doesn't even believe in following or honoring the law, and who obstructs justice, who violates the Emoluments Clause, who attacks the First Amendment, who is appearing to have very disconcerting ties to enemy governments and autocratic dictators, right? So we need to really focus on what it means for us to move things forward in a constructive, healthy way and make this country a better place. So I guess we'd have one final serious conversation point then here, and that is, as you're seeing on the news, former Vice President Joe Biden is now in the race in the Democratic primary. What to make of this? Here's what I want to say about this. I see two things that we want to consider. Number one, it is good news to have someone in the race who has good executive branch experience. He was a member of the Obama administration. He was the vice president. He therefore has a slew of experiences that certainly would appear to render him, to a degree, perhaps significantly qualified on the surface. And I want to really put an emphasis on this notion of on the surface. I think that while, therefore, we can be mindful of the fact that it's good to have Biden in the race, in my opinion, I don't think that we should jump to any hasty conclusions about whether or not he's the one that we want to support. And I'm a little bit concerned by how the media is painting Biden as this perfect guy, or almost perfect guy, except for his tendency to gaffe. But he's sort of being painted as like the great guy, whereas Bernie Sanders is sort of being casted as the bad guy, right? Overly simplifying what the race should look like to people without an intellectual conversation. And that concerns me. Look, I appreciate Joe Biden. I really do. And I think that he has a lot of constructive things to offer. But I'm not so sure that a sort of mindless endorsement or mindless biased support of his candidacy is going to be a healthy thing. He needs to be seriously vetted. He needs to be subjected to debates. And we need to see how he's going to respond to things. We need to see what his policy agenda is going to be. And with his tendency to gaffe, we need to see, can this guy really compose himself when he's thrust into the public light a little bit more deeply than he was when he was vice president. And so I want to give you one example of like something really disconcerting I read. This was in a Washington Post article this morning, written by Michael Scherer and John Wagner. It was posted just this morning. Former Vice President Joe Biden jumps into White House race. This is from the Washington Post. And they're citing this guy, a former chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party, Dick Harpootlian. I hope I haven't butchered that. But I don't have an audio on this, so I don't know how to pronounce it. And here's what he says, and I find this as disconcerting as I find the way people are talking about Sanders, but in the opposite sense. He says, we need to get more pragmatic and understand that Joe Biden is the only real chance to win in 2020. I'm sorry, but first of all, who made this guy such a god that he can make such huge predictions without knowing all of the facts, such as the fact that he didn't exist tomorrow? I just am deeply against people who rely too much on prediction and not enough on what ought to be and trying to make possible what ought to be. I'm not saying that we ought to be delusional idealists. I'm a realist. But to say that Joe Biden is the only person with a chance to beat Donald Trump, I think that's so not objective, especially when you don't substantiate that. But look, it's the same kind of thing, this propping up Joe Biden as the great front runner who is the only person with a chance who's going to win, who's our great chance. It's the same thing as the way they try to smear Bernie Sanders as the guy who wrote about liberal female sexuality in his college newspaper in the 1960s, half a century ago, and then was poor for a little bit in the 1970s. I mean, come on. The bias here on both sides is just extremely disconcerting. And so I say, have we learned nothing from 2016? Do we not remember when Jeb Bush was the front runner and how irritated people were that just because he was the son of one former president and the brother of another and a former governor, just because he was this mainstream moderate Republican, that it should just be handed to him? This infuriated the electorate. And I would honestly be fearful of the prospects of a equally infuriated electorate on the left if Biden just gets handed the presidency, or he's just assumed to be great. And everyone goes out of their way to paint him as great without having an objective intellectual conversation. Or they, or on the opposite side, they just sort of smear Bernie Sanders without examining, for example, how he paints himself as a socialist and having a conversation about that as opposed to what he did half a century ago in the college newspaper. That said, look, I'm not trying to paint a negative picture of Joe Biden, as I said. I'm not discounting him. I'm just merely saying I don't think that we should just mindlessly prop him up and not think about things. Um, so what did I want to say? So, for example, as a sort of positive about Biden that I appreciate here. Yeah, so some things that I think that do make him interesting, that certainly compel me to keep my eyes on him. He was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee during the confirmation battles over Supreme Court nominees Thomas and Bork, right, back in the day. And he was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee at the time of the 9/11 attacks. And this is a little bit more information again from that Washington Post article. Just one place where you can learn a little bit more about Biden. The point is, I mean, the guy has noteworthy experience, and he is certainly someone who I think is overall very good for the country. Am I positive he should be the president? No, but I mean, the guy has perks. There are pluses to him. I'm just saying, let's have an objective conversation about it. So, I mean, there you have it today. We've covered the three topics that I really wanted to talk about. A little bit more on what's going on with the president and some folks running for president. And these are just some things that I really wanted to convey to you for your consideration. And if you have any comments, I do invite you to please let me know what you think. I would only hope that you would be constructive in it. I don't really do the whole trading insults thing or irrational contests. I just like to look at the facts. And I certainly, if you think I've contradicted myself or you think I've missed something important or you have a thought, certainly I want to know these things. I thank you for taking the time to share this space with me. And I hope that you have a fantastic day. And I do look forward to chatting with you again soon in the future. A fantastic day. Bye-bye.